Twice, and we are live. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Monica Kang. I am the founder and CEO of InnovatorsBox, where we unlock creativity in the workplace. Today, I have a very special episode. I mean, every episode is very special, but I'm really pumped about today's conversation because the short gist is basically merging my two worlds. For those who know my personal background, innovation wasn't really on my resume until a few years ago, frankly. My former work was in public policy, but specifically in the world of nuclear weapon security. So I actually dug up some books because I wanted to show you the evidence for people who are like, but Monica, you have paintings in your background. I don't believe you. Like, this is some of the books I still kept, I still have. Would like to go back at times, just maybe not in the past few weeks because I need some positivity out there. But one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this particular episode is people often assume that innovation is only in certain domains, certain industries, and as you all know here, that's not true. And so I'm excited because there's a lot of innovators in all fields, and especially in nuclear security and nuclear weapons. And with COVID-19, of course, everyone is needing to adjust differently. And that's one particular field that I know for sure that in-person engagement, in-person trust and collaboration, multiple stakeholders is so critical. So thank God I know the space and know two amazing people who are not only innovating, but have been doing so for a very long time and now just doing 10x more of that because of the situation. And so with that being said, let me introduce you to these awesome folks. And the questions and comments you have, let me know. But with that, do we have Lovely here?
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Lovely Umayam. I've known Monica for a really long time, but we started off in the nuclear policy field, I think about 7 years ago. I've been doing nuclear nonproliferation work for almost a decade. Had time doing it in the government as well as in an NGO capacity. And now I am essentially spearheading my most creative project in that space, which is called Bombshell, and that's a policy and arts collective. So nice to be here. Thank you so much, Monica.
And Dr. Roy, do we have you here as well?
You do indeed. Hello. So yes, so it's lovely seeing you again. It hasn't been that long. So Monica, I met you 5 years ago now at the International Technical Working Group on Nuclear Forensics. I forget which city because it moves around a lot. I was bowled over by your enthusiasm when we first met and figured you weren't going to stay in nuclear forensics for very long. You left a lot faster than I imagined. And you really have embraced this your creative side, it has to be said, and I'm really honoured to be a part of this and take part in these broadcasts. It's going to be exciting.
Awesome. Thank you both very much. I'm so excited to have you both. And so now for all of you there, you can see all three of us so that you can get to know. And so foremost, especially for this audience group, one thing that I always look back in our nuclear times is that, we do have a little bit of a bubble, if we can be honest, right? Like, unless you're in the nuclear space, it is really hard to know what's actually going inside. And so since we do have a community out there who is now very intrigued of like, okay, well, Lovely and Dr. Roy Awbery, like what in the world do they do? Like, what does that mean? I would appreciate it if you can untangle that a little bit more. Maybe, Roy, if we can speak with you first, we'd love to understand, I know nuclear forensics in itself is a jargon, even in the nuclear world space. Could you share us a little bit more? What does that even actually mean? And why is that work important? And how are you contributing to that space?
Okay, so nuclear forensics, probably the best analogy I can give you is think NCIS or CSI, whichever the popular program is. Something turns up in nuclear material. It turns up where it shouldn't or with someone who shouldn't have it. The term we use is material outside of regulatory control, but basically it's not where it ought to be and certainly not where we want it to be. And ideally we'd recover it, or law enforcement will recover it. And we will want to know what the material is, where it's come from in the nuclear fuel cycle, not necessarily which country it came from. That's a different branch of investigation, but we want to know where in the nuclear fuel cycle it's come from. Has it come from a power plant? Is it part of a fuel pellet? Worst case, is it part of something far nastier? And the nuclear forensics, the forensics element, is that categorization and characterization of the material. So is it uranium? Is it plutonium? Great. What flavor of uranium and plutonium, so to speak? And then looking at things like its internal signatures, the characteristic signatures. If it's got certain impurities, does that tell us something special about where it came from in the nuclear fuel cycle? So all of those questions support law enforcement. They're usually the main customer. But of course, in any country that processes nuclear materials, there's always an owner. In the UK, that's the Ministry of Defence or the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BEIS, just rolls off the tongue. So they want to know, it's a very fundamental question, did we lose our own material? You don't want the material to come from outside of your country, but you equally really don't want to have lost any from your own stock. So we need to know that, as well as understanding where it came from. So that's nuclear forensics in the round.
And I mean, thank you for highlighting that, because at the short, just really, it's all these questions that somebody has to always ask, and there's really nothing black and white, which is the whole reason why I have this beautiful book, which is one of the nuclear forensics book that we all need to learn about, from our amazing community. But one thing, you know, and this, I think, Lovely, is where I also hugely respect in the work that you do, because as you know, Dr. Roy Awbery has just highlighted that there's all these questions, even as experts need to navigate. And the challenge is that it's not just the experts knowing it, you need the community who are not in the nuclear space to actually understand and relate. And that relates to a lot of the work and why you are passionate. Could you share a little bit more about how your journey has been, and, you know, why did you get to choose to focus on that lens of nuclear security?
Yeah, sure. So I do just want to affirm the fact that it is a bubble. I feel very comfortable when I talk to a lot of my policy peers, but when it comes to friends and family, that's when it gets a little bit convoluted, because there's a lot of layers to explain. But over time, I've gotten good at it and have found that my creativity, my artistic side, has been really helpful in conveying that world. And so just before I get into your question, I just wanted to explain nuclear security, because that in and of itself has nuance. So, I think some people use nuclear security as an umbrella term to just secure nuclear materials in order to prevent, you know, bad guys or countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. And within that, there's also, you know, very technical subtopics like nuclear safeguards, nuclear security, nuclear safety, nuclear forensics. And for the past 10 years, I've come to specialize in not only nuclear safeguards, but more recently, nuclear security. And nuclear security in that technical sense is preventing, you know, the bad guys, non-state actors, non-state entities from acquiring nuclear material. And the best way to think about it, and I'm sure that you all have heard this within our little bubble, is the idea of the guns, guards, and gates. It's really the physical protection of nuclear material, and also cybersecurity. And so a lot of my work is in that space when I put on my policy hat. But then to your question of how do I articulate, you know, my goals, my aspirations to the people around me outside of the bubble. When I do that, I look at nuclear issues writ large. So I'm not only just looking at nuclear security, because that in and of itself is very sensitive. And, you know, there's reason to protect that space. And I'm more looking into what are nuclear histories that people should be aware of. What does it mean for regular people to interact with nuclearity Yeah, like history, exactly. You know, a lot of people may be familiar with the Manhattan Project in the United States. That's usually how people are typically, that typically become familiar with the history. There's also, you know, just popular culture, right? Like how people encounter nuclear issues in TV and movies. So that's essentially the creative part that I'm now focusing on, because I think that it really makes a difference on how, you know, my family and my friends are exposed to the issue and how that they inform what they think I do. But anyway, I hope that that answers your question.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And what I hope, audience, again, what you're hearing is that the reason why I have both of them, and where you might initially, you know, say like, okay, Monica, other than that, you were in nuclear, what am I supposed to get out of this? You should have picked up a lot of key insights, what both of them have shared, right? The key aspects of, at the end of the day, one of the things we've been kind of emphasizing in every show is just, it's really in the mindset. It's really in the way of being able to see things differently, and to have that eye means you have to have that curiosity and willingness to explore that no matter what industry you're in. And so that's the very reason why you find innovators and creative thinkers in every industry, including in nuclear weapon and security and safeguards and forensics. And what I hope you're hearing is the keywords of how they are both articulating and how they've had to reframe their thinking to bring those values, as Lovely has said, whether it's, you know, working with different stakeholders or, you know, communities who might not traditionally relate, or as, you know, Dr. Awbery has highlighted, of like working with multiple stakeholders. So we're going to continue to dive in, but, you know, as you're watching this later on, I want you to take a moment and reflect about your industries of like, are we perhaps also in our own bubble, as Lovely has mentioned, right? Are there things that perhaps you might want to explain a little bit better so that other people could understand? And with that being said, Dr. Roy, I mean, the other thing that I've always really been fascinated about forensics is just that sheer amount of data and stakeholders that you have to communicate and stay in touch. But, you know, one thing, as we just spoke about, forensics is a bubble within a bubble. And I've always been curious about like, how do we make sure that other people learn about it, but then more stakeholders build trust? And so curious if you have some insights and wisdoms that you've learned over the years, because you've been in forensics for a long time, and also with your background in science.
Yeah, so the key to this, I mean, you are right that there's an enormous amount of data that's involved, not just when you get to a point where you want to actually exercise the nuclear forensics capability itself. You've got to be prepared in the first place. So you have to understand, each state has to understand what material it has, what it looks like. So there's a lot of data collection and collation going on. That characterization, you can't characterize something you found if you haven't characterized your own material. You know, you've got to know what it looks like. So we put a lot of effort into that, as do most other states that have some involvement in nuclear material. One needs to remember that it's not just a nuclear power that has a vested interest in nuclear materials. Many countries have nuclear materials transiting through, or they use the materials for various purposes, medical, for instance. So the stuff turns up all over the place, and most states will want to know what they've got. So there's a lot of effort put into the data collation and understanding of data. Gets worse. I won't get into the depths of this, but you also have to understand the uncertainties in your data. Not all of the data is complete. My statisticians have a great phrase called missing data. For about a month, I thought they'd lost it. It turns out it's just the data you don't collect. Material is analyzed, but it's only analyzed for what the customer wants. For forensics, we'd love to know every single impurity that exists in the material, because then we've got a treasure trove of signatures. But if the customer for that particular material is only interested in the aluminium, the iron, and the strontium, well, that's great for them. It's not so great for us. So there's some effort to be put in to understand materials when you've got missing data. So there's a lot of extrapolation, interpolation to be done.
So then how do people who come from all those different places work together? Because I think that's always been the fascinating thing from understanding forensics is like, okay, there's already that miscommunication and what that missing data means, which is, I think, as you're all watching, you should be thinking about this. There's probably data we're all missing out because we're not collecting or thought we didn't need. But how do we make sure that cross collaboration and trust building happens? Because you've been working globally, both with your team. And one of the things that I was always fascinated was just that trust building is so critical. Could you share maybe like one or two advice that you've learned over the years that was helpful in your trust building when there is data and things?
Well, there is. So the collaborations are absolutely key to this. Some of them are open, some of them are not open, that you're aware of. I won't go into the not open collaborations, but the open ones, a really good example is the work that the International Atomic Energy Agency does, providing guidelines. They set up conferences where we can talk about this sort of stuff. Lovely alluded to earlier, the cybersecurity aspect of this. There was a big focus on cybersecurity in Vienna at the Vienna International Conference Center last year, or earlier this year. The International Technical Working Group on Nuclear Forensics, which meets yearly, Monica, as you know really well, that really is a working group for those practitioners. You don't just pitch up, it's not a conference. You've got to be a member state, you've got to be involved and a key laboratory or key entity to be involved in it. But the collaborations and the conversations we have there are key. And the beauty of that particular forum is that you can discuss all your problems, warts and all. And that really does help build trust, because we do get states saying, I don't know how to do this. I don't understand missing data. I don't understand how I report uncertainty in my numbers. The UK has been doing a massive amount of work to help advise the ITWG on communicating uncertainty. How do you communicate something complex to government and police stakeholders? I can give you a little example, a short story. When I listened to somebody presenting some data, some results, and they referred to the activity level of a particular material, radioactive material, and they used something along the lines of 6 times 10 to the 23. So they've used an index number, which, let's face it, if you're not a scientist or a statistician, you're not going to know what 6 times 10 to the 23 means. And just saying there's lots of zeros on it isn't going to help. And of course, the other issue is if you use non-common terminology. So activity, of course, he was referring to becquerels. Well, that's great if you know what a becquerel is. So you've got to be really careful. So we've spent a lot of time working within the ITWG and with the IAEA to help people understand these different terminologies and how to communicate at the right level to the right stakeholders. Room full of scientists, absolutely use that terminology. But if you're speaking to the police or a government official, the further up the chain you get, the more simple the language needs to be.
Absolutely.
And to pull back to your point about trust, if you bamboozle people with jargon, you lose their trust straight away. They have no idea what you're talking about and they stop listening. And if it's a nuclear forensics case, the last thing you want is somebody to stop listening. So we spend a lot of time talking, collaborating, and enhancing the communication.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I wanted to make sure we dig in a little bit deeper, just because it could feel a bit complex for those who have never thought of this. And, it took me time to navigate, and, but there's all the keywords that, he just highlighted, which is, at the end of the day, constant communication, knowing that it's not going to be overnight, knowing that, there's going to be multiple places you build trust. I usually in traditional business marketing, we talk about the 7 touch points that you like to meet multiple times. Now at this point, it's 11 touch points if you want to build trust with somebody that you've never done. But in regards to security, national security, that's going to need a whole nother level of trust, and know that where that missing data and all that is. And so, Lovely, I'm seeing your head nodding back and forth because I know you have a lot to add. Tell me a little bit more why this resonates with you and where you sit, and also why that related to maybe perhaps your project with Bomb Shelter as well.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate all of Roy's comments, because it is true that communication is key in gaining trust within our particular community. And, I feel like I'm one of those outsiders that ended up somehow inside unintentionally, because I didn't aspire to be part of the nuclear field. I wanted to be a spoken word poet. I was going to be a writer. And so I definitely had to work, once I realized that I also had a passion for public policy, which eventually got me into international security studies and nuclear policy. I had to work really hard in trying to understand, the different trust points that I have to gain, and who the stakeholders are. And so just to give you a sense, the multiple stakeholders that I engage with, when I put on my, hard research sort of policy hat, I'm talking to nuclear operators. I'm talking to other nuclear policy experts in Vienna. And, when you're thinking about securing nuclear materials, I've learned over time that, the science is important, but really it's a language of risk, understanding what the risk appetite is, what is the risk profile of a given situation. And so that's a language that I have to learn and know when to, I guess, like use when appropriate. And then when I talk to, outside of the technical sort of nuclear space, where I'm just talking to young folks, high school folks who might be interested in public policy, then, I don't necessarily bring that up, but I bring up, nuclear imagery, again, going back to what I said earlier about understanding the entry points that a lot of people have when it comes to nuclear issues, which tend to be nuclear explosions or mushroom clouds or glow in the dark aliens, the Simpsons with the three-eyed fishes. And so I use that as an entry point because they understand that language, if you will, or that visual sort of language. And from there, try to tell them what this world can be. And hopefully that will inspire them to, as outsiders, come in and care about the work and hopefully become the next generation. I mean, that's always something that we worry about in this space. Like, who will we pass the baton to when we're all old? Like, how does this, issue resonate when there's so many other things to care about? And part of that, I think, is just the lack of education of how fascinating and important mission critical this work can be. But you have to find those or create those doors for people to go into. And again, it's just really understanding who your audience is. But it's not just, identifying them, but really, really understanding who they are at their core. When I was starting off, I mean, in our where we met, Monica, right? Our fellowship. I mean, I had to hang out with a lot of scientists and learn what a becquerel is, right? And just having an open mind. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I've perfected the technical side of the work. I know enough to operate in this space, and I also know when to ask for help and know when to collaborate, knowing that I don't know everything. And so it's time to tag team a certain problem with someone is also really important in this space.
So many golden nuggets from both of you. Just to recap again, just really highlighting one of the things that continue to show up in so many of our conversation is how important it is to have an open mind, to actively listen, and really ask the question, who are you serving? Like, what's the whole point of you innovating, creating, and doing what you do? Because I think when that why is lost, we might end up creating solutions or creating insights without really having insights in what it's going to be used for. And so, Lovely, thank you for emphasizing again about, who is in fact the stakeholders and audience, which, Roy has highlighted as well about who are we actually serving to work with all these different stakeholders? And so if I may, like, I would love to actually dive in, because, you know, I see you smiling as Lovely was talking about the next generation, because that's the question I know in forensics, we talk a lot as well. And as a result, I know you've had a particular solution that you got to celebrate last year with a great event. Could you share a little bit more about the conference that you were able to put together, and what was the unique aspect of that? Because, you know, there's a lot of conference. What was so special about this?
Yeah, so one of the things I like doing is challenging why we do things the way we do it. Just because we do it doesn't mean it's the right way. So I spend a lot of time asking why. And one of those was conferences. We go to a lot of conferences. My team goes to a lot of conferences throughout the year. And I was a little disappointed when I asked someone what they got out of a conference. And Monica, you'll forgive me because you know this story well. It's how we met. I'm the consummate networker. I will look at who's going to a conference, do my homework, find out who I want to meet, and then I'll make sure that I meet them when I get to that conference and talk to them, constructively talk to them, and come away with something useful for me and hopefully something useful for them. What was disappointing was a lot of people that I know and who were working for me at the time thought the success of a conference was how many business cards they'd collected. And they hadn't even spoken to the people afterwards. They didn't follow up. They didn't do anything at all, which is just sad. They just maybe chatted for a few minutes, collected some beer mats, quite frankly. That's all they were worth by the end of it. And I looked at how conferences are constructed, and effectively, and I'll have to apologize if I offend anyone who organizes conferences now, but this is just what I saw, and I go to a lot of them myself. You tend to have experts on stage talking about their expert area. Yep. To an audience of fellow experts, people who are already bought in. You're selling to the people that are already buying your product. So you're not expanding, you're not growing the knowledge base. And particularly in nuclear forensics, we don't tend to invite students, undergraduates, PhD students, and this kind of thing, because they're not the experts in nuclear forensics or nuclear forensics related fields. So it seemed a little pointless. It was the preachers preaching to the converted. What's the point? So I came up with a different idea, shameless plug, New4, Nuclear Forensics.
I will tell you
now.
Share while we speak. I have the website ready and articulate.
Yeah, I'm going to apologize for the catchy title, New4 2019. There it is. I actually set up a working group, 6 people who brainstormed for a few weeks a catchy title for a nuclear forensics conference and came up with New4. I should sack all of them. So
we'll keep
anyway, we had, well, it's stuck now and it's catchy and people remember it. But last year we had the very first conference, New4 2019. How is it different? So basically, I asked for the great and the good, the really influential people in nuclear forensics, those people who are producing the most papers, leading the biggest research teams, leading government policy, leading a police force that's involved in nuclear forensics, all those sorts of people. And I wanted them to present their best stories, the exciting stuff, really sell the excitement of nuclear forensics, and do this on the stage. But the audience were not going to be their buddies and their friends that are working in the same field. The audience was deliberately chosen to be complete novices or people who had no clue about nuclear forensics at all. And how did we do that? We went to the universities, predominantly in the UK, and said, we're doing this conference. Would you like to send your undergraduates, your PhD students? They could be working in geochemistry, planetary science, any field that you would not think is related to nuclear forensics. I wasn't looking necessarily for radiochemists or metallurgists or statisticians. Why wouldn't I do that? So if you take geologists, for example, they know a lot about rock. Uranium ore is a rock. effectively, or came from rock. So they know a lot about particle size analysis, for example. So they've got skills that they can bring to the party. Planetary science. I had no clue when I joined this that I would need someone who had an expertise in moon rock, and equally someone who had an expertise in trying to interpret the rings of Saturn and the clouds on Jupiter. Of course, they use spectroscopy. Spectroscopy is used widely throughout nuclear forensics. So we're tapping into other people's skills that are completely transferable, but we're able to grow our subject matter expertise base. So we also advertised this conference internationally. We only expected about 50 people to come to the very first conference, and we had just under 100. Before the conference finished, it was only 2 days. Before the conference had finished, we had over 150 expressions of interest to present at the conference, let alone turn up to the next one. And in fact, it was so successful this year, due to coronavirus, we've had to postpone it to next year, sadly. We're now looking at an alternative way, a creative way of keeping that rhythm going. And we're going to try and do some pre-recorded webinars with some of those leading experts and some setup questions, and present that possibly like this, Monica, with a sort of YouTube channel, just to keep it alive. But you're absolutely right. The job is to get the new talent in, and if you're outside of that nuclear forensics bubble, you don't know what it is. I mean, I've canvassed opinion at universities that we deal with, and it's amazing. If you mention nuclear forensics, people genuinely don't know what it is. If pushed, they can hazard a guess that it's forensics, but they don't know what it involves. They don't know that you're working with the police or government stakeholders, this kind of thing. So New 4 is my way of answering that. Bringing in a different way of presenting nuclear forensics to those who wouldn't know about it, and getting them excited. And I'm pleased to say it really has taken off. I've got to give big thanks to the Institute of Physics, who run the conference for us, and they do a sterling job, I have to say. But it was an absolute success. I'm really proud of the team that I put around me. I'll be honest, I just come up with ideas and then find teams to deliver for me. Delegation to empowerment.
No, thank you.
But they did a fantastic.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say they did a fantastic job, and hopefully we'll keep this going. It will get bigger, and we will then draw in experts from elsewhere around the world as well, including yourselves.
Yes, absolutely. I thank you so much for highlighting that and sharing that. I hope all of you who are watching are getting some good ideas, because I think often the next generation question is something that now that I've been in innovation and entrepreneurship, it's a question that we ask in every industry. They were like, how do we figure out Gen Z? It's like so hard. How do we figure out like our whatever next generation? You were being millennials. And I think one of the things that I appreciate, Roy, for you sharing that, is that we often complicate the situation. We often feel like, okay, if I don't have like this market data research and I have all these things, and it's not going to work. But that simple question of like, well, we got to create an experience where they can relate, so that they actually learn why this is fun. As like Lovely said, it's like a fascinating and exciting field if you know where to go and how to navigate. I mean, there's a reason why I did love being part of it. The only reason why I had to pause for a bit is how the word choice I like to use is because I can't do two jobs well. I had to choose one for the time being, but I still stay in touch because I am fascinated. So, and there's just so much to do. And, Lovely, now I can't wait for you to share a little bit more about Bombshell, to which we didn't speak yet, because you found a creative way. You've already been doing this for a few years. And tell me a little bit more. I have that webpage up as well. So we'd love to just learn a little bit more, and tell me, what was the specific problem solving that you wanted to address, again, in that gap of information and the stakeholders that you wanted to serve? So please.
Actually, well, first of all, Roy, now I need to be part of whatever conference you'll be organizing next time, because I want to learn more about nuclear forensics. I think what you did is really awesome. Very, very different from the way that people hold conferences in the field. Just wanted to emphasize something that you said, which is really the field is multidisciplinary. I think people from the outside see it as, oh, nuclear experts, and just have a very abstract like notion of what that is. Like, you need to know rocket science, you know, like that's how my family is like, are you a physicist? And I'm like, no, I'm you know, and that's usually the first guess that people have who have no background in nuclear policy. Like, are you a physicist? I'm like, no. And but you know, it takes many different kinds of people, many different kinds of skill sets to do this work really well. And so I thank you for highlighting that and creating a forum for people to get together in that way. So Bomb Shelter is somewhat similar in that, but it's a more abstract and really leans into like the creative spectrum, the far end of the creative spectrum, in terms of actually literally producing art in order to communicate nuclear policy. And so the people who I collaborate with are artists, historians, scientists, and we typically just, you know, focus on a subject that we're interested in, and then we produce artworks around that. So Bomb Shelter, any nuclear policy expert, any artist who's always been curious or interested in what nuclear policy is, any one of those are invited. And as sort of the founder and creative producer, my job is to pair them together and find opportunities for them to get funding and present these pieces. And so I've had the fortune of doing a few of these already. And I don't know if Monica actually have.
Can I share the website? Because your website actually has some good examples. If I can share the website.
Yeah, and I actually have one of the books that I wanted to show. But yeah, you could scroll through my crazy website. So as you can see, it looks insane. It's not what you.
I already love it.
What you think of nuclear issues, but the Godzilla image is actually inspired by a dear friend of mine from grad school. Her name is Sayaka Shingu. She's Japanese, and we had this wonderful conversation about Godzilla and how a lot of Americans don't know the genesis of Godzilla, because most Americans have seen the American version and not the Japanese version. And Godzilla was actually inspired by one of the nuclear tests that the United States.
I was always curious about that. So that
yeah. So the storyline is that, you know, a nuclear test woke up this sea monster, and Godzilla actually, you know, part of it is, you know, or I guess it's a she, I don't know, but has like a radioactive beam, like laser beam, you know, capability to destroy cities. So that's sort of the quick spiel about Godzilla and why Godzilla is on the landing page of my website. And actually Sayaka and I collaborated on an article together, which ended up being the first Bomb Shelter written piece back in 2013 that compared the Japanese version and the American version, and where the nuclear history was sort of scrubbed or eliminated out of the American version. But in any case,
that's what Bomb Shelter means.
Oh yeah, so that's actually, it's kind of funny because it was a joke. So it's two words combined. It's bomb shelter and shell-toes. And shell-toes is a slang for a type of shoe. It's like an Adidas shoe, the one that looks like it has like a turtle shell toe. That's why it's called shell-toes. They're very popular in the hip hop sort of pop culture community. And so those are the two words combined. And it's supposed to be a joke name that just stuck. And so now for branding purposes, can't get rid of it, but it's very endearing. I love the name. But in any case, yeah, so this is the Bomb Shelter website, and in it I have many different projects. I have and I also do a lot of speaking engagements, just talking about the intersection of arts, culture, and nuclear policy, with the thesis being, we as the greater public consume nuclear images in pop culture that we don't even know. And then that formulates what our perception of what the field is. And I think that's for better, for worse, right? And so I have these projects. One of them is a collaboration with a select group of Navajo community members to talk about the uranium mining tied to the nuclear weapons production process back in the 40s up until the 60s in the American Southwest.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that we created, or we're in the process of creating a 360 VR film with this amazing director. Her name is Kayla Briett, executive producer Sunny Dooley and Adriel Lewis. I also have a website that tries to experiment with the narrative of radiation and explaining what radiation is, because textbooks, I think, don't do it justice. I think it's a beautiful, complicated, challenging storyline that I think people tend to fear immediately, but there is a lot to unpack. And actually, if you don't mind,
Yes.
Monica, I'll talk about Atomic Sublime by just showing you the book.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Screen share.
Yeah. And so actually, this is the one thing that I wanted to bring up during our conversation today, because, I think that when we've talked a lot about stakeholders, right, and who gets to have a voice in the field, and for almost like a decade of my time in the field, it's always been the scientists, it's always been the policymakers, but in talking to a lot of community members outside of the field, particularly Indigenous peoples in the American Southwest, I also came to understand the land as a very active protagonist or character or stakeholder, because when we do nuclear testing or when we mine uranium, land is involved. And so one of the most recent projects that I embarked on with a few artists is called Atomic Sublime, which is an art book. And this is a collaboration with Passenger Pigeon Press, which is a Harlem-based independent press, Tammy Nguyen and Taya. And we also had two technical experts inform the narrative. But just really quickly, it's not your typical book. It's an art book. And so you basically, the way that you read it is you dig through the layers of the land. And it talks about atomic sublime and sublime landscapes in the American Southwest. And then you eventually come up to the two essays about Arizona and Nevada, Arizona representing the uranium mining that happened in the Grand Canyon back in the early, I think, 50s or late 50s, early 60s, and also Nevada, because that's where the United States tested about 1,000, I think, nuclear explosions, the last being in 1992. And where sort of the wonk nerd side of me comes in is I wrote the book. I did not create the book. This is, again, I know what my limitations are, and I collaborated with people who are actually better at this than me, like Taya and Tammy. But one of the cool things that we were able to do is we've included like excerpts of like technical like reports, government reports about these two sites. Anyone can Google them. They're not classified, but I think the idea is to sort of give, the people who encounter this book, like a taste of what it looks like to read, you know, what I read as a nuclear policy expert when I do research. And so it within the pages are hidden, you know, public reports that you kind of uncover and you know, read on your own as a user of it. So this is all handmade by Passenger Pigeon Press. We had about 250 books. And the very cool thing is some of those books have made it into special collections in different institutions just because of the way that the book is constructed is very unique. And so, and a few museums have also acquired it. So it's really good to, it's a good feeling to know that, you know, this kind of nuclear interpretation of it can be found in museums that wouldn't think twice about nuclear issues. But anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much for both of you for sharing all these creative, clear ideas. And Lovely, we already have someone, Ren, who's like, is it possible to purchase the book somewhere? So I did put your website. Dr. put your website too. I know for the time being, we're not doing the conference this year, but I'm sure people would want to know. And so with that being said, unfortunately, time is coming up. So I am super sad, but this was so fruitful. I think traditionally, because there's a lot of aspects where we piggyback on, but this time it was so meaningful to kind of do a little bit deeper dive in each one of your stories. And so thank you for taking the time to kind of explaining a little bit more in depth about the projects that you're working on and the creative ways you navigated. And one thing that I would love to kind of ask as we wrap up is thinking, I muted myself. We covered all these different realms. I would love to hear a little bit more for the listeners. You know, they're probably getting all these different ideas like, okay, I can think about next generation. I'll think about stakeholders. I'll think about whether it's the creative collaboration, re-understanding who I work with. But if they forget everything, what is at least one or maybe two things that you would have them walk away with? And I would love to start with Roy, if I can have you first and have you share. And tell us why that lesson is important as an innovator, regardless of being in nuclear or not. Why is that advice important? And after that, Lovely.
Yeah, I think you could probably work it out from what I've said earlier. The first one is to challenge everything. I came into my role 5 years ago from something very different, working in London. And yeah, I just challenge everything, and I'd urge everybody to do that. I ask my team to challenge me. I may lead that part of the program, but it doesn't mean I have all the answers, and I need to listen. So yeah, challenge everything. And the other bit is, as you will totally expect, build an effective network and collaborate. And I really do mean effective and collaborate. Don't just collect business cards. Don't just collect a Rolodex of names. It won't do you any good. Keep in touch with people. I frequently email people every few weeks just to say hi, keeping in touch, just so they know I'm alive. We're in nuclear forensics after all, we've got to be careful. It's not that bad, really. But yeah, just build effective networks. Make friends with everyone that you can, because you just don't know when they will be really useful. And I think those are my two take-home messages.
Thank you for saying that. And yes, that's how we were able to stay in touch with both of them, because I could have easily said like, sorry, I left nuclear, I can't talk about it. But no, I'm like, well, people are the same. I want to stay in touch with amazing people. So thank you for highlighting that. Lovely.
I think what Roy said about challenging everything is so important. I think I drive some people crazy in the field because they say, why not this? Why don't you do it this way? And I think they don't, you know, they get annoyed because the answer is like, I don't know. And then they start confronting the fact that it's just being done just because, and there's actually no reason behind it. So I think that's incredibly important to remember. And just going back to our conversations about being multidisciplinary, I think that that's incredibly helpful, that understanding like your strength is not just your expertise expertise necessarily, but the way you think about your expertise, because I feel like no one can take that away from you. If, I learned that, Roy is a nuclear forensics expert, but also thinks critically about networking. That's incredibly unique. And for me, I do nuclear security, but I also am able to navigate the arts. And that's, I've never seen that anywhere in, at least within the network that I operate in. And so I think, that's where uniqueness lies, and to not be afraid of exploring those intersections in your skills.
And that's one of many reasons why I admired you when I first met you in the fellowship. Lovely, special. Her way of thinking, I hugely admire. And so
it's a little crazy, but
that's the best part. You got to be crazy enough to explore and be open to asking these questions. And so as a final part of the question, I know I said final, but I get to post play. So I get to ask more questions as we wrap up. The question is like, oh, sorry. Hey, Emily, great to see you. Yes, hopefully have your students rewatch this. I'm sure they're going to have a jazz about it. So many golden nuggets here. But I want to ask both of you, because the other question I think I would assume other would ask is like, okay, that's great. So what in fact has inspired both of you? Because from what they are seeing, at least from now, it's like you guys kind of figured out, but I know you both of you took the time to figure out, to get creative, to find more creative ways. And so, Roy, I know at least for you, I know part of the paintings that you have in the background is not accidental. Could you share a little bit more about your kind of work in painting? But even before painting, I know you've always been kind of finding different ways to create it, because painting, you said actually you only started recently, but tell me a little bit more, where do you get creative inspiration, and also share about your artwork?
Yeah, well, quite frankly, I get bored very quickly. So the painting, you're right, I only started a year ago, and discovered a brilliant tip for anyone who's ever thinking about painting and can't do it. I could not paint. My wife bought me watercolor sets at Christmas. I didn't touch it for a year, dug it out, had a go. I was rubbish. Tried again the next day. I was still rubbish. Frustrated. I didn't want to fail. So I set myself a challenge of painting every day for 30 days. Two things happen, or could happen. One, you can get good. I got good. And it becomes a habit. And I ended up painting every day thereafter. And I still paint every day when I'm not doing this. Yeah, the creative element, you're right. When we met, you were asking me about the book that I'm not writing. I'm told with all authors, if you haven't finished, you're not writing the book. And I'm still not writing that book. I have written bits to it, but yeah, I like expanding my knowledge. I don't read fiction. I only read textbooks. I'm really boring, geeky. I want to learn things, and I'm inspired by other people that can teach me things. When I came into nuclear forensics, I was bowled over by the expertise, but also the passion of the people working in this field, because as Lovely's already alluded to earlier, it can feel a little bit isolated, a little bit bubble. But even, and there are some, sensitivities about some of the work we do, but the passion that drives people is incredible, and you can't fail to have it rub off on you, quite frankly. So yeah, I've got a natural tendency towards wanting to not be bored and learn new skills and develop things. But I also, as I said earlier, I listen and I watch other people with great interest, and I'm inspired by the people around me, and including you two. I mean, Monica, I've been following your change in direction after you left state. Absolutely incredible. And Lovely, I've just signed up to follow you on Instagram.
That's why I said, if I think of two people who are creative in the nuclear world, I was like, I absolutely must have them on our show, because to talk about this in a different way. Sorry, we're going to add one more thing.
No, I was just going to say I will definitely be inviting Lovely to the conference.
I
really need to talk about that.
And I think that I have a few artist friends who would love to do something around nuclear forensics, actually. So.
Well, you've made me wonder how I can put nuclear forensics onto these now.
Just to answer your question, Monica,
yes, please.
again, I think I'm different because I've always aspired to be an artist first before being like a nuclear nerd. And I was just talking to a friend about this. I don't necessarily have any role models. I mean, I have some wonderful colleagues in the field that I look up to, but a lot of my role models are artists and writers. And so that has been incredibly helpful for me. You know, so I guess my creative inspiration doesn't, I guess I just want to emphasize that your creative inspiration doesn't necessarily have to be in your field. You know, I have a lot of peers that are like, oh, I love this diplomat's work. I follow this, which is great. But for me, I love writers, and I do suffer from writer's block as well, Roy. And so whenever I start, I always have like open books of like my favorite authors to just get me like in that space of like, I can be inspired too. And so Zadie Smith, Teju Cole, James Baldwin, like some really like beautiful communicators on the written page are always my go-to creative folks that get me started.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, for all of those, if this was a live event, it's like, thank you so much. Live round of applause and just a big gratitude, because I think, like I said at the very beginning, for me, when I had to transition, I'll use that word choice, transition from being in nuclear to innovation, I always thought about, you know, and I tell with people often when they ask me, how has my work in nuclear helped the work I do in innovation? And I say, a lot, if you actually think about it, because at nuclear, you have to work with multiple stakeholders. You have to listen. You have to not assume. You have to be multiple disciplinary. You have to travel a lot. You have to remember multiple time zones. And I think there's actually a lot of transferable skills that prepared me to the work I do, because that's the business realm, and many more so, because I think we often underestimate what parts of the skills that we bring wherever we go. And so just as both of them have said, you know, even for me, I didn't know I was going to go to nuclear. I kind of went into it, and I didn't know I was going to go into innovation. I didn't know we were going to even have this live conversation until a few months ago, until we hit COVID. And so with all of that being said, I hope these conversations, it is particularly for today's, really inspired all of you to think about, okay, whether you're a student right now or professional, or even somebody who's about to retire, that's an exciting moment of whatever life point is. It's up to all of us to figure out what we want to make out of it with it. And so as both Lovely and Dr. Roy Awbery has shared, there's many ways. Continue to ask questions, stay open-minded, and, you know, simple thing, just rewatch this show, right? Well, go back and rewatch and see what golden nuggets we had. But on my side, we're going to continue on these Mondays episode next month. As we start a new month, I'll just share some theme updates. But I got some new guests that I am super excited to continue these conversations of how to reimagine and rethink. And so we're going to talk about how some leaders are doing in youth education now that they can't meet in person. We're also going to talk about how somebody who's using perfume making into team building. And we're also going to talk about how in the world is a hackathon, where it's highly in-person engagement, changing. So many more to come. And I hope you all enjoyed and found it helpful. And with that being said, we will see you next week or next month. So thank you, Lovely and Roy. We will see you again. Bye.